Chapter 12, and he says, therefore, since we also have such a large cloud of witnesses, he goes on to write, let us lay aside every hindrance and the sin that so easily ensnares us. So the first thing we see here is that we're surrounded by this cloud of witness, and we are detangling ourselves from sin. So you're surrounded and detangled at the same time. And this is a blessing to us that we get to read this in the first verse. Because this word witnesses, it doesn't mean that they're spectators watching us, that they're looking down on us and they're watching everything we do. There have been some great sermons preached from this text like that. But instead, it's that their lives are bearing witness for us. That as we look to them, we get to be encouraged. We get to be exhorted to live according to the promises of God, understanding that though man may fail, God never does. It also testifies to the fact that there's a sufficiency of grace. That you see this sufficiency of grace in their lives. Though they struggled, though they walked in ways that were broken in some ways. For example, Abraham lying about his wife repeatedly. You see God's grace is sufficient for him. You also see it not only in moments of failure and falter, but you also see it in moments of trial and circumstance, where they are facing great trials. You think about Elijah as he stands against the prophets on Mount Carmel, and you see all the things that are taking place there and unraveling before him, and yet the Lord's grace is sufficient in that moment. The Lord's grace sustains him in that moment and continues to provide. Even after that mountaintop experience, you see Elijah down in the depths saying, oh God, just take my life from me. It's over. And the Lord refreshes him. And so we get to see these witnesses are actually bearing witnesses of what their God is able to do. And it testifies to the sufficiency of his grace, but also to the faithfulness of God to his promises. And then he goes on to tell us, he said, now, because we are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every hindrance and the sin that so easily ensnares us. The author here uses an example from competitors back in the day that were training. And they would be doing these trainings, and they would load themselves up with weight so that they would build up their endurance. A modern example would be when you see somebody playing baseball and they're on deck and they put weights on their bat and they're taking practice swings and they're trying to develop within themselves power, and they're trying to develop within their moments. So it's when their turn to up the bat, they're able to swing with full force, and their training is paid off. Well, this is a picture of training, but the picture here is that these things entangle us. It's sin that wraps itself around us. And he says, lay aside every weight. And then it goes on to say this, it says, or the sin that so easily ensnares us. Now, there's an interesting debate here. What is the sin that entangles us? Is the author of Hebrews here referring to Israel's lack of faith and their lack of obedience based on faith over and over throughout the scripture and throughout redemptive history? Or is this one of those moments where it's almost like that passage where Paul writes about his thorn in the flesh, and we don't know what his thorn was? Some of us maybe get to heaven and be shocked to find out it was a thorn in his side. Others of us may be shocked to understand it was a personal struggle, a hardship. The word is clear that it was a messenger from Satan to tempt him, to continue to agonize him, put him through agony. And so what we see is there's no clarity on what this sin that entangles us is. And I think that's the Lord's grace for us as we read the word. Because that sin that entangles you may be different than the sin that entangles me. That sin that causes you to stumble and walk through this difficult road may be that difficulty for us and may be different for us. And so this is what we see as we get to ask ourselves, what is it in my life that I'm allowing to tangle me up, to cause me to stumble, to constantly walk in this pursuit and constantly falter in my pursuit of the Lord and in his ways? And this is what the author would say to us. He'd say, therefore, since we have such a large cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us then lay it aside. Let us then shake it off. Make sure that we detangle ourselves from the sin. And so we want to just encourage you at the beginning of 2025 to take this matter very, very seriously. to look inside of your life and see what areas of your life you've allowed Satan to come in and disrupt what God is wanting to do in your life. Maybe there are some of you here today that have this weight of unforgiven sin. You've never trusted Jesus Christ with your life. You've never surrendered your life to Christ. You are still carrying the full burden of your sin and of your sorrow and of your shame. You're still carrying the full weight of that, still in guilt, still in shame. And today, the good news is that Christ can remove that burden from you and lay it upon himself on Calvary so that you can have forgiveness of your sin and walk in complete freedom.